July 18, 1863, Morris Island, South Carolina. 7:45 p.m. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw stood at the front of 600 black soldiers and looked across the killing ground. Fort Wagner sat 800 yards ahead, a sand fortress bristling with Confederate artillery. Between Shaw's regiment and those walls lay a beach barely wide enough for 3 men to walk side by side. The Atlantic Ocean crashed against one flank. A salt marsh stretched along the other. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to take cover, nowhere to run except straight into Confederate cannon fire. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment had been fighting for 2 days straight without rest. They were exhausted, hungry, and soaked from wading through marshes. Shaw had just been told his men would lead the assault. Not support it, not follow behind white regiments, lead it. Behind the Confederate walls, 1,800 defenders waited with loaded rifles and prime cannons. They had spent the entire day watching Union artillery pound Fort Wagner's sand walls. The bombardment had done almost nothing. Now, as the sun dropped toward the horizon and the shelling stopped, Confederate soldiers took their positions and waited for the assault they knew was coming. Shaw turned to face his regiment. These were men who had been born into bondage, escaped to freedom, and volunteered to fight for a country that had never treated them as equals. Most Northern whites doubted they would fight at all. Confederate soldiers had spent weeks mocking them from the fort's walls. Even some Union officers whispered that black men lacked the courage for a frontal assault against an entrenched fortress. Shaw raised his sword. The beach stretched ahead like a narrow corridor of death. "Forward, 54th!" The regiment surged forward across open sand toward Fort Wagner's guns. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment had existed for less than 5 months when they reached Morris Island in July 1863. Massachusetts Governor John Albion Andrew had created the unit in January after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation opened military service to black Americans. It was a radical experiment that many white Northerners opposed and even more doubted would succeed. The recruitment effort had been extraordinary. Frederick Douglass himself had written passionate appeals urging black men to enlist. 2 of his own sons had joined the 54th. Men came from across the North, many of them formerly enslaved people who had escaped to freedom. They came because military service meant more than just fighting. It meant proving that black Americans deserved citizenship, deserved respect, deserved equality under the law. But skepticism followed them everywhere. Northern newspapers questioned whether black men possessed the courage for combat. Political opponents of Lincoln's administration claimed that recruiting black soldiers would fail because they would desert under fire or refuse to fight. Some Union generals didn't want black regiments under their command at all. Confederate attitudes were far worse. Southern newspapers mocked the very idea of black soldiers. Confederate military doctrine stated that captured black soldiers would not be treated as prisoners of war, but returned to bondage or executed. The Confederate Congress had passed a resolution declaring that white officers commanding black troops could be executed for inciting insurrection. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw understood exactly what was at stake. The 25-year-old officer came from one of Boston's most prominent abolitionist families. He had volunteered to lead the 54th Massachusetts, knowing that Confederate forces had vowed to kill any white officer leading black troops. His decision to accept command had been difficult. He knew he was placing his life in extraordinary danger, but he also believed in the men under his command. The 54th had trained intensely throughout the spring of 1863. Shaw drilled his soldiers relentlessly, determined that when the regiment entered combat, their performance would be flawless. But training camp was one thing. Actual battle was something else entirely. Their first real test had come just 2 days earlier at Grimball's Landing on James Island. On July 16th, Confederate forces launched a surprise attack against Union positions. The 54th Massachusetts, with only 250 men in the line, faced a Confederate assault force of 900 soldiers. Some Union officers expected them to break and run. They didn't break. They held their ground, firing disciplined volleys that stopped the Confederate advance cold. Union General Alfred Terry, who had been skeptical about black soldiers before the battle, wrote in his official report that the 54th had shown steadiness and soldierly conduct under fire. It was the first time the regiment had proven themselves in combat. But one successful defensive battle wasn't enough to silence the doubters. The real question remained unanswered. Would black soldiers charge into enemy fire? Would they assault a fortified position? Would they accept casualties and keep advancing when the mission seemed hopeless? Union commanders in South Carolina had been trying to capture Charleston for months. Fort Wagner was the key to the entire campaign. The sand fortress sat on Morris Island, guarding the water approach to Charleston Harbor. Every Union attack had failed. The fort's position made it nearly impossible to assault. A narrow strip of beach, barely 180 feet wide, was the only approach. Attackers would have to charge across open ground while Confederate artillery poured fire into them from above. The fort itself was defended by 700 Confederate soldiers with cannons, mortars, and rifles positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. On the morning of July 18th, Union artillery and naval guns had bombarded Fort Wagner for 8 hours, trying to soften the defenses before the assault. The bombardment had accomplished almost nothing. The fort's sand walls absorbed the shells without significant damage. Only 8 Confederate defenders had been killed. The rest waited in bomb-proof shelters, ready to man their guns the moment the shelling stopped. Brigadier General Truman Seymour needed a regiment to lead the assault. He chose the 54th Massachusetts. The decision was deliberate. If black soldiers led the charge and succeeded, it would prove their capability beyond any doubt. If they failed, Seymour could claim he had given them the chance and they hadn't measured up. Shaw was told around 6 p.m. that his regiment would spearhead the attack. The 54th had been marching and fighting for 2 straight days without rest. The men were exhausted and hungry. They had spent the previous night wading through salt marshes during a difficult withdrawal from James Island. Now, after barely any time to recover, they would lead a frontal assault against the strongest Confederate fortification in South Carolina. Shaw gathered his officers and explained the mission. Some of them understood immediately that this was likely a suicide charge. The approach was too narrow, the defenses too strong, the Confederate artillery too well positioned. But they also understood what refusing would mean. Every opponent of black military service would use it as proof that black soldiers lacked courage. There was never any question about whether the 54th would attack. The first artillery shell screamed overhead before the 54th Massachusetts had covered 50 yards. Sand erupted in fountains where Confederate mortars found their range. Men dropped without a sound, torn apart by shrapnel before they could even cry out. The survivors closed ranks and kept moving forward. Shaw ran at the front with his sword raised. His orders were simple: reach the fort, climb the walls, take the position. There was no complicated strategy because none existed. The beach was too narrow for tactical maneuvers. They couldn't flank the fort. They couldn't take cover. They could only charge straight ahead into the guns and hope that speed and courage would carry them through. Confederate artillery crews worked their cannons with mechanical precision. They had spent months preparing for exactly this kind of assault. Every gun had been sighted to cover the approach. The defenders didn't need to aim carefully. They just needed to fire into the mass of men charging across open sand, and every shot would hit someone. Canister rounds turned cannons into giant shotguns, spraying hundreds of iron balls across the beach. Men fell in clusters, cut down by projectiles that shredded flesh and bone. The regiment's formation started to break apart as soldiers stumbled over bodies or tried to help wounded comrades. Officers shouted orders to keep the line moving. There was no time to stop. No time to treat the wounded. No time for anything except forward momentum. The Atlantic surf crashed against the soldiers on the right flank, soaking them with spray. The salt marsh on the left side stank of decay. The regiment pushed forward through both. squeezing through the narrow corridor of beach while Confederate rifles joined the artillery fire. Muzzle flashes lit up Fort Wagner's walls like lightning strikes. The sound was overwhelming. Cannons booming, rifles cracking, men screaming, officers shouting orders that could barely be heard over the chaos. Darkness fell quickly. The sun had already been setting when the assault began, and now twilight faded into night. Smoke from the guns mixed with the gathering dark, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. Soldiers followed the men in front of them, trusting that they were still heading toward the fort and not veering off course into the marsh or ocean. Shaw kept moving, Joe kept. His white uniform made him an obvious target, but he stayed visible at the front where his men could see him. Leadership meant being where the danger was greatest. It meant showing his soldiers that he would ask nothing of them that he wouldn't do himself. At 150 yards from Fort Wagner's walls, the Confederate defenders opened fire with rifles in coordinated volleys. The disciplined fire cut through the 54th's ranks like a scythe through wheat. More men fell. The survivors pressed forward. 100 yards. The fort's walls loomed ahead, dark and massive. Confederate soldiers lined the parapets, firing down into the approaching regiment. The angle gave them perfect shots at men who had no cover and no way to fire back effectively while running. 75 yards. The 54th reached the water-filled moat that surrounded the fort. Some soldiers plunged straight in, wading through chest-deep water while trying to hold their rifles above their heads. Others tried to find shallower crossings. Confederate gunfire poured down on them from above. Shaw reached the moat and climbed through. Water soaked his uniform. Mud sucked at his boots. Behind him, his regiment fought through the same obstacle while under constant fire. Men drowned in the moat, pulled under by the weight of their equipment after being wounded. Others made it across and began climbing the slope toward the fort's walls, 50 yards. The Confederate fire intensified. Defenders threw hand grenades down onto the approaching soldiers. The explosions added to the carnage. 25 yards. Shaw scrambled up the sandy slope toward the parapet. Soldiers of the 54th climbed beside him, bayonets fixed, determined to reach the top. Some fell backwards, shot from above. Others kept climbing. Shaw reached the parapet first. He stood on top of the fort's wall, sword raised, and shouted, "Forward, 54th!" His voice carried across the battlefield for a moment. Then 3 Confederate bullets hit him almost simultaneously. One struck his chest, another hit his abdomen, the third tore through his heart. Shaw fell forward into Fort Wagner, dead before his body hit the ground. The soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts didn't stop. They climbed over the parapet where their colonel had just died and dropped into the fort itself. They were inside Confederate lines now, fighting hand to hand in the darkness against defenders who outnumbered them more than 2 to 1. Sergeant William Carney grabbed the regiment's American flag when the color bearer was shot down. A bullet hit Carney in the head, stunning him. He stayed on his feet. Another bullet struck his chest. He kept the flag raised. A third bullet tore through his right arm. He transferred the flag to his left hand. A fourth bullet hit his right leg. Carney dropped to one knee, but held the flag upright, refusing to let it touch the ground. Confederate defenders rushed forward with bayonets. Hand-to-hand combat erupted across Fort Wagner's interior. Soldiers of the 54th fought with rifles, bayonets, fists, anything they could use as a weapon. They held sections of the fort against repeated Confederate counterattacks. The battle raged in darkness and gunsmoke. More Union regiments attempted to follow the 54th into the fort, but Confederate fire cut them down on the beach. The 54th Massachusetts found themselves isolated inside enemy lines, surrounded, outnumbered, and taking casualties every minute they held their positions. They held for over an hour. Inside Fort Wagner, soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts fought in near total darkness. Gunsmoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the night to create a fog that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Men fought by sound and instinct, firing at muzzle flashes, striking at shadows that moved in the wrong direction. The regiment had breached the fort's defenses and now held positions along the western wall. Confederate soldiers rushed from all directions to drive them back. The fighting was brutal and close. Bayonets, rifle butts, fists. Soldiers used whatever weapons they could. There was no room for formations or tactics, just raw combat between men who understood that every second mattered. Sergeant William Carney had carried the American flag onto the parapet after the color bearer fell. Now wounded 4 times and bleeding from his head, chest, arm, and leg, he knelt in the sand and kept that flag upright. Confederate soldiers tried to reach him, tried to capture the colors. Carney held his ground. Other soldiers from the 54th formed a protective ring around him, fighting off attackers while their sergeant refused to let the flag fall. Colonel Shaw's body lost somewhere in the fort's interior. Without their commanding officer, other leaders stepped forward. Captains and lieutenants rallied men around them, trying to organize some kind of defensive position that could hold against the Confederate counterattacks. They knew reinforcements should be coming. The assault plan called for multiple waves of Union regiments to follow the 54th Massachusetts into the fort. Those reinforcements never arrived in strength. Other Union regiments attempted to cross the same killing ground the 54th had just traversed. Confederate artillery and rifle fire cut them down on the beach. The 6th Connecticut Infantry made it to the fort's walls, and some soldiers climbed over, fighting their way inside to join the 54th Massachusetts. Elements of the 48th New York and other regiments reached the parapet in small groups, but the numbers were wrong. The plan had called for thousands of Union soldiers to overwhelm Fort Wagner's defenders through sheer mass. Instead, only a few hundred made it inside the fort, and they faced 1,700 Confederate defenders who knew every corner of the fortification they had built and occupied for months. Confederate officers organized their counterattacks with precision. They pulled men from sections of the fort that weren't under assault and concentrated them against the Union soldiers who had breached the western wall. Fresh troops from the 32nd Georgia Infantry arrived as reinforcements, giving the defenders an even greater numerical advantage. The 54th Massachusetts had been fighting for over an hour. They were exhausted before the assault even began, having spent 2 days marching and fighting with almost no rest or food. Now, after charging across 800 yards of open beach under artillery fire, crossing a water-filled moat, climbing the fort's walls, and fighting hand-to-hand inside the fortification, they were running on willpower alone. Ammunition was running low. Soldiers searched dead and wounded men for cartridges, taking ammunition from wherever they could find it. Some fought with empty rifles, using them as clubs. Others picked up Confederate weapons, dropped during the fighting. Confederate hand grenades exploded among the Union soldiers. The primitive explosives weren't particularly accurate, but in the confined space of the fort's interior, they didn't need to be. The blasts wounded men who had already survived rifle fire and bayonet charges. More Confederate reinforcements arrived. The 51st North Carolina Infantry, which had held defensive positions during the initial assault, now moved forward to join the counterattack. The defenders outnumbered the attackers by more than 3-1 now, and that numerical advantage was beginning to tell. Union officers could see the situation deteriorating. They had taken the parapet. They had breached Fort Wagner's defenses, but they couldn't hold their positions without reinforcements, and those reinforcements had been unable to reach them in sufficient numbers. The beach approach was too narrow, the Confederate fire too intense. Around 10 o'clock at night, nearly 2 hours after the assault began, Union commanders ordered a withdrawal. The decision was devastating but necessary. Staying inside the fort meant certain death or capture for everyone who had made it that far. The order filtered through the ranks. Soldiers who had fought so hard to reach this position now had to abandon it and retreat across the same ground they had just crossed. Sergeant Carney, wounded 4 times and barely able to walk, began crawling toward the parapet with the flag still held above him. He would later say that he never let the colors touch the ground, not even when he fell. The withdrawal was as deadly as the assault. Confederate soldiers pursued the retreating Union forces, firing into their backs. Men fell into the moat and drowned. Others collapsed on the beach from exhaustion and wounds. Some were captured by Confederate troops who rushed out from the fort to take prisoners before the Union forces could escape. The 54th Massachusetts fell back in whatever order they could manage. Small groups of soldiers provided covering fire while others retreated. Then those groups fell back while others covered them. It was a fighting withdrawal conducted in darkness and smoke, with Confederate guns firing constantly from the fort's walls. By the time the survivors reached Union lines, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment had been shattered. 600 men had begun the assault. Fewer than 300 answered roll call after the battle ended. The morning sun rose over Morris Island on July 19, 1863, revealing the full scale of what had happened the night before. The beach leading to Fort Wagner was littered with bodies. Union soldiers lay where they had fallen, cut down by artillery and rifle fire during the assault. The water-filled moat held more dead, men who had drowned after being wounded or who had simply been too exhausted to climb out. Inside Fort Wagner, Confederate soldiers walked among the bodies of Union troops who had made it over the walls. They found Colonel Robert Gould Shaw's body near the parapet where he had fallen. The young officer lay with 3 fatal wounds, his sword still clutched in one hand. Confederate officers recognized Shaw from his white colonel's uniform and knew he had commanded the black regiment that led the assault. General Johnson Haygood, the Confederate commander who took charge of Fort Wagner that morning, made a decision he thought would humiliate the Union forces. He ordered Shaw's body thrown into a mass grave along with the bodies of his black soldiers. In the Confederate mindset, being buried alongside black men was the ultimate insult to a white officer. They misjudged completely. When word reached Shaw's family in Boston, his father responded with a statement that became famous across the North. "We hold that a soldier's most appropriate burial place is on the field where he has fallen." Shaw's mother added that she could imagine no greater honor than her son being buried with the brave men he had led. The intended insult became a source of pride. Union officers counted their losses through the morning. The numbers were devastating. Of the 600 soldiers who had charged with the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment the previous evening, only about 315 answered roll call. The regiment had lost nearly half its strength in a single night. 30 men had been killed outright during the assault, including Colonel Shaw and 2 of his captains. Another 24 would die from their wounds in the days ahead. 15 soldiers had been captured by Confederate forces. 52 men were listed as missing and would never be accounted for, likely buried in the mass graves that Confederate soldiers dug in front of the fort, or drowned in the moat, or lost in the darkness of that terrible night. The total casualty rate for the 54th Massachusetts was 42%. Nearly half the regiment had become casualties in approximately 2 hours of combat. The other Union regiments that participated in the assault had suffered similarly terrible losses. Overall, Union forces lost 1,500 men killed, wounded, captured, or missing from the evening's fighting. Confederate casualties numbered 174, a stark indicator of the advantage held by defenders firing from fortified positions against troops attacking across open ground. General Quincy Gilmore, who had ordered the assault, recognized immediately that frontal attacks against Fort Wagner would not succeed. The position was simply too strong, the approach too narrow, the defenses too well prepared. Any future attempts to take the fort by direct assault would result in the same bloody outcome. Sergeant William Carney survived his wounds. Despite being shot in the head, chest, arm, and leg, he had crawled back to Union lines with the regimental flag still held above the ground. When he finally reached safety and collapsed, his first words were, "Boys, the old flag never touched the ground." Carney would recover from his wounds and later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions, though the award would not be presented until 1900, making him the first black soldier to receive the nation's highest military decoration. Among the Confederate defenders, there was grim satisfaction at having repulsed the assault, but also a grudging respect for the courage they had witnessed. The black soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts had charged across impossible ground, climbed the fort's walls, fought hand-to-hand inside the fortification, and held their positions for over an hour against superior numbers. They had done everything that was asked of them and more. Confederate soldiers who had mocked the idea of black troops before the battle were noticeably quieter afterward. Whatever racist assumptions they held about black men lacking courage for combat had been thoroughly disproven on the beach and walls of Fort Wagner. In the Union camps, white soldiers who had witnessed the 54th's assault spoke with admiration about what they had seen. Regiments that had doubted whether black soldiers would fight now understood the answer. The 54th Massachusetts had charged into hell itself without breaking, without retreating until ordered, without showing anything except absolute courage under fire. The assault had failed to capture Fort Wagner. The fortification remained in Confederate hands and would stay that way for another 7 weeks until the defenders finally abandoned it under siege operations in September. By any tactical measure, the Battle of July 18th was a Union defeat, but something far more important had been won. The question that had dominated Northern debates about black military service, would black men fight, had been answered definitively. They would fight. They would charge impossible positions. They would die for the cause of freedom with the same courage as any soldiers in American history. News of the assault on Fort Wagner spread across the northern states within days. Telegraph operators tapped out the details to newspapers in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington. The story was remarkable enough on its own. A frontal assault against an impregnable fortress, terrible casualties, extraordinary courage under fire. But what made the story capture national attention was which regiment had led the charge. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment became famous overnight. Northern newspapers published detailed accounts of the battle, describing how black soldiers had charged across 800 yards of open beach under artillery fire, climbed Fort Wagner's walls, fought inside the Confederate fortification for over an hour, and only retreated when ordered to do so. The soldiers had done everything asked of them and more. Frederick Douglass, whose 2 sons had served in the 54th during the assault, wrote powerful editorials about the battle's significance. He argued that the courage shown at Fort Wagner had settled forever the question of whether black men would fight. Any American who still doubted should look at the casualty lists, should read the accounts from white officers who had witnessed the charge, should consider what it meant that these soldiers had held their ground inside an enemy fortress against impossible odds. The impact on recruitment was immediate and dramatic. Before Fort Wagner, Union officials had struggled to convince black men to enlist. The obstacles were substantial. Federal law paid black soldiers less than white soldiers, $10 per month versus $13 for white troops. Black soldiers faced execution or enslavement if captured by Confederate forces, while white soldiers received treatment as prisoners of war. Black regiments were often assigned to manual labor instead of combat duty, digging trenches and hauling supplies, while white regiments fought. After Fort Wagner, those obstacles remained, but they were no longer enough to prevent enlistment. Young black men across the North saw what the 54th Massachusetts had accomplished and understood that military service offered a chance to prove their worth as American citizens. Recruitment offices that had been nearly empty in June were flooded with volunteers by August. The numbers tell the story. By the end of 1863, more than 50,000 black soldiers had enlisted in the Union Army. By the war's conclusion in 1865, that number exceeded 180,000, nearly 10% of the entire Union military force. Approximately 40,000 black soldiers died during the war, fighting for the freedom of 4 million people still held in bondage across the South. The Bureau of Colored Troops, established in May 1863 to organize black military units, rapidly expanded its operations. New regiments formed in every northern state and in border states like Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. As Union forces advanced into Confederate territory, formerly enslaved men joined the army in massive numbers. By late 1863, Black regiments were fighting in every major theater of the war. White soldiers who had witnessed the Fort Wagner assault spoke openly about what they had seen. Soldiers who had doubted whether black troops belonged in the army changed their opinions. Officers who had opposed the recruitment of black soldiers now requested them as reinforcements. The 54th Massachusetts had proven something that no amount of debate could establish. Courage under fire knows no color. The battle also changed how Northern civilians viewed black Americans. Before Fort Wagner, many white Northerners supported emancipation but doubted whether formerly enslaved people could function as equal citizens. The idea of black men serving as soldiers, bearing arms, accepting military discipline, risking their lives for the nation, challenged fundamental assumptions about race and capability. Fort Wagner provided undeniable evidence that those assumptions were wrong. Black soldiers had charged into the same hell that white soldiers faced and had performed with the same courage. They had died for their country just as white soldiers died. The sacrifice demanded respect, and increasingly it received that respect from a Northern public that was beginning to reconsider its views on citizenship and equality. General Ulysses S. Grant, who would soon take command of all Union armies, recognized the military value of black soldiers and actively recruited them for his campaigns. He understood that every black soldier who enlisted strengthened the Union cause while simultaneously weakening the Confederacy by removing a potential laborer from Southern plantations and farms. The assault on Fort Wagner had failed to capture the Confederate fortress. By any tactical measurement, July 18, 1863 was a defeat, but the strategic victory was immense. The 54th Massachusetts had transformed the war and changed the nation. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment never recovered its full strength after Fort Wagner. The casualties had been too severe, the losses too devastating, but the regiment continued to fight. They participated in the siege operations that finally forced Confederate abandonment of Fort Wagner on September 7, 1863, after 60 days of constant bombardment. They fought in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina for the remainder of the war. They were present in Charleston when Union forces finally occupied the city in February 1865. The soldiers who survived Fort Wagner carried the memory of that terrible night for the rest of their lives. They had charged across open ground into artillery fire. They had climbed fortress walls under murderous rifle volleys. They had fought hand-to-hand inside Confederate positions against superior numbers. They had held their ground for over an hour before retreating under orders. They had done everything that could be asked of soldiers, and they had done it knowing that the entire nation was watching, judging, deciding whether black men deserved to be called Americans. Sergeant William Carney recovered from his 4 wounds and continued serving with the 54th Massachusetts until the war ended. He returned to civilian life in Massachusetts, working as a mail carrier. In 1900, 37 years after the battle, he received the Medal of Honor for his actions at Fort Wagner. The ceremony made him the first black soldier to receive the nation's highest military decoration. When reporters asked about the battle, Carney would describe carrying the flag through Confederate fire and always ended with the same words: "The old flag never touched the ground." The monument to the 54th Massachusetts was dedicated in Boston in 1897, facing the Massachusetts State House. The bronze relief sculpture shows Colonel Shaw on horseback leading his soldiers toward battle. The faces of the soldiers are individualized, each man a distinct person rather than an anonymous figure. The sculptor, Augustus St. Gaudens, spent 14 years creating the memorial. He understood that he was commemorating not just a regiment or a battle, but the moment when black Americans proved their right to citizenship through sacrifice and courage. The legacy of Fort Wagner extended far beyond the immediate military impact. The battle became a rallying point for advocates of equality and civil rights. If black men could fight and die for their country with the same courage as white men, then how could the nation justify denying them equal treatment under the law? The question troubled the American conscience for decades after the war ended. The fight for equal treatment continued long after the guns fell silent. Black veterans returned home to face discrimination, violence, and denial of the rights they had fought to secure. The promise of citizenship that military service seemed to offer proved difficult to redeem in a nation still deeply divided over questions of race and equality. But the example of the 54th Massachusetts remained a powerful argument that could not be dismissed or ignored. During World War I, when the military debated whether Black Americans should serve in combat roles, advocates pointed to Fort Wagner. During World War II, when the armed forces remained segregated, civil rights leaders cited the 54th Massachusetts as proof that segregation was unjustified. During the Korean War, when President Truman ordered military integration, the legacy of Fort Wagner was part of the historical foundation for that decision. The 1989 film Glory brought the story of the 54th Massachusetts to millions of Americans who had never heard of Fort Wagner. The movie took significant liberties with historical facts, but captured the essential truth. These soldiers had faced impossible odds with extraordinary courage, and their sacrifice had changed the nation. Young people who watched the film learned that Black Americans had fought for freedom long before the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Today, the beach where the 54th Massachusetts charged toward Fort Wagner is quiet. The fortress itself was destroyed during the siege operations and further damaged by erosion. The Atlantic Ocean has reclaimed much of Morris Island. But the memory of what happened there on July 18, 1863, remains powerful. 600 men charged into hell to prove they deserved to be called Americans. Nearly half of them became casualties. Their courage settled the question forever. The soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment fought for a nation that had never treated them as equals. They charged into artillery fire to prove their worth to a society that doubted them. They died on a South Carolina beach to secure freedom for 4 million people still held in bondage. They showed the world that courage, honor, and sacrifice recognized no color. They were American soldiers, they were heroes, and they changed everything.